I created the real dirt to show Americans the corruption within the food system, to be a clear voice, not biased, and to give you the real facts and to give you my views on how I would do things if I was in charge. RFK Jr. and the former FDA commissioner went on 60 Minutes with a very clear message. In this video, I'm going to tell you the history of GRAS, why they are talking about it, and my conclusions, the part that nobody's talking about. I'm Michelle. I spent 16 years in the food industry, and this is the real dirt. Have you ever picked up a product at the grocery store, flipped it over, and looked at the ingredients list and had no idea how to pronounce any of that? You're not alone. And here's the real problem that you should really think about more than the spelling. Nobody approved them. Not the FDA, not an independent lab. The company that makes the product looked at their own ingredient and decided, hey, we think it's safe. And that's good enough. That's it. That's the whole process. This is what GRAS is, generally recognized as safe. It's a legal designation created in 1958 that allows food companies to add ingredients to your food without going through the FDA approval process, as long as the company decides the ingredient is safe. Now, here's where my experience matters. I want to be fair because the original idea behind GRAS actually makes sense. Salt is GRAS, vinegar is GRAS, pepper and garlic, flax seeds, things that humans have been eating for thousands of years do not need a clinical trial to prove that they're safe. That's reasonable. I know because I use GRAS myself. For 16 years, I worked within the organic food system. I sourced whole ingredients like flax seeds, millet, sunflower seeds. GRAS was the framework that I lived in. And for those products, that is the right framework. A seed that humans have been eating for thousands of years do not need a billion-dollar clinical study. The problem is what the food industry did after that. They took a system designed for flaxseed and used it to self-certify industrial chemicals, synthetic emulsifiers, and lab-engineered compounds with no human consumption history at all. And today, there are over 10,000 chemicals in the American food supply, and at least 1,000 of them have never been reviewed by the FDA, not even once. The FDA doesn't know what they are, where they're used, or whether they're safe, because nobody was required to tell them. That is not a loophole. That is a system working exactly as the industry designed it to be. To understand GRAS and how it got hijacked, you first need to understand why it was created in the first place. And this story goes back further than 1958. In 1906, a publication that told Americans that their meat they're eating was being processed with rotting scraps and fillers, the public outrage forced Congress to create the FDA. But here's the thing they don't tell you. The FDA they created had no real power. Manufacturers could still put poison in your food as long as they labeled it. For 30 years, Congress did nothing. The industry ran wild. The FDA literally created a traveling expedition, and they called it the American Chamber of Horrors, showing toxic products that were perfectly legal, and they were powerless to stop it. Congress did nothing. In 1937, a drug company in Tennessee wanted to make a liquid antibiotic. Their chemist dissolved it in a chemical that was essentially antifreeze because it tasted sweet. They never tested it for safety. Over 100 people died, many of them children. Behold, that bill that was sitting in Congress for 5 years finally passed. It took children to die. That's how the 1938 Food and Drug Cosmetic Act finally became into law. Finally, the FDA had some power. But even then, food chemicals were still largely unregulated. After World War II, the chemical industry exploded. Hundreds of new synthetic preservatives, dyes, and emulsifiers flooded the food supply with zero oversight. In 1958, they finally passed the Food Additives Amendment, and here's where GRAS was born. It started with a simple idea. Foods that humans have been eating for years don't need clinical trials. Your great-grandmother's salt does not need $1 billion study. That was the original intent, reasonable, practical, and honestly good. but industry lobbied for a hard, complete grandfather clause, an automatic approval for every chemical already in use with zero testing required. That's when GRAS was compromised. And there was one big fatal flaw built right into it. The flaw was self-certification. Under GRAS, the company could look at their own ingredient and decide, we think it's safe. No independent review required. No obligation to tell the FDA. The company just saying so. And then in 1997, the FDA made it even easier. They replaced the affirmation process with a voluntary notification system. Voluntary. Companies could now add new ingredients to food and weren't even required to tell anyone. Today, there are at least 1,000 chemicals in your food that the FDA has never seen, never reviewed, and doesn't even know it exists. Now compare that to drugs. To bring a new drug to the market, a pharmaceutical company has to run years of clinical trials to prove it's safe and effective and spend over $1 billion before it ever reaches a shelf. That's something you take occasionally when you're sick. But a chemical that's in your cereal, your bread, your salad dressing, every single day for 3 times your entire life, that company can just self-certify and never tell a soul. The regulatory food bar is way lower than drugs. And how many of these grandfather chemicals have actually ever been banned since 1958? A handful. But the scariest number isn't how many chemicals have been banned, it's how many have never been looked at, because you can't ban what you've never examined. And here's the comparison that puts all of this into focus. You probably have heard European bans things that America allows. Red dye, certain pesticides, preservatives, and most people hear that and think, Europe is just more cautious. That is not quite right. The difference isn't caution. The difference is the legal standard. In the EU, if you want to add a new ingredient into your food, you have to prove it's safe before you can sell it. The burden of proof is on the company. You have to prove it's safe or it doesn't go in. In America, it's the exact opposite. You add the ingredient, you sell the product, and then someone else has to prove it's harmful before anything is done about it. The burden of proof is on the public. It takes decades. Trans fats, it took 40 years. That is not a difference in caution. That is a fundamental, different legal philosophy about who gets protected and who carries the risk. In Europe, the consumer is protected until the product is proven safe. In America, the product is protected until harm is proven. Those two systems produce very different grocery stores. So, why were RFK Jr. and the former FDA Commissioner David Kressler on 60 Minutes together? These two men agree on almost nothing about public health, but they sat side by side saying the same thing. GRAS has been hijacked. Kessler compared it to tobacco. He said it's as large as a public health crisis, if not larger than smoking, because not everybody smokes. But look at how many people eat ultra-processed foods. RFK Jr. said the GRAS is a loophole that was hijacked by industry and used to add thousands upon thousands of ingredients into the food supply with no way for any American to know that they're safe. Strong words. But then the 60 Minutes correspondent asked the obvious question, are you going to do anything to regulate this in industry? And RFK Jr. blinked and said, and I want you to hear this clearly, I am not going to regulate ultra-processed foods. Our job is to make sure everybody understands what they're getting. And here's my read on what actually happened on 60 Minutes. And I haven't heard anyone say this. RFK Jr. went on the most publicly watched news program in America, not to announce regulation, not to announce a ban. He went on there because that was his only move he has left. Because the legislative and regulatory avenues have been taken away from him. The corporations already have the power. It was RFK Jr. telling the American public, I can't fix this from the inside. You're going to have to fix this with your dollar. And here's what I think about that. after being in the system for 16 years. He's right. The regulatory system was never fully on your side. It was always a compromise between public health and industry pressure. From the very beginning, from 1906, the act that couldn't stop poison in our food as long as it was labeled. From 1938, the law that required children to die before it was passed. From 1958, the compromise that gave the industry self-certification loophole that they wanted all along. The dollar was the only vote that always worked in this system. When Americans stopped buying trans fats, companies removed them before the ban. When Americans started demanding organic, the organic industry created a supply chain, not because they cared, because you wanted to buy organic. So here's what I would do if I was in charge. I would adopt the EU standard. If you want to put something in our food, prove it's safe first. Not to yourself, but to an independent body before it goes into the food supply. And at a very minimum, every company that self-certifies GRAS ingredients should be required to publicly disclose it. Full transparency. If the ingredient is safe, you have nothing to hide. That's not regulation. This is information. And the informed public is the one thing the food industry always has been the most afraid of. But I need to leave you with something that just happened last week because it changes the equation. Throughout this entire video, there has been one theme. The regulatory system was always a compromise. Congress moved only when people died. The FDA was always outgunned by industry lobbying. GRAS was designed with a loophole built in. But through all of it, Americans still had one last check in the system, the courts. If a chemical harmed you, you could sue. And juries were awarding real money. Bayer paid out for glyphosate cancer settlements. The legal system was working until last week. Trump granted immunity to glyphosate, the last accountability mechanism. The one thing that did not require Congress to act, it did not require the FDA to move, it did not require a politician to show courage. It was just removed. And RFK Jr., the man who sued Monsanto over glyphosate, who went on 60 Minutes to warn you about chemicals in your food, publicly said he would not put American farmers out of business and he would not touch GRAS loophole that he is publicly warning about. Read between the lines. His hands are literally tied. This is his only move. So let's be honest where we're at. The regulatory pathway is compromised. The legislative pathway is compromised. And now the legal pathway is closing. The only vote you have left is with your dollar. This is not cynicism. This is the system as it actually exists right now. If you haven't seen my video on glyphosate and the immunity they just received, I encourage you to go watch it. The GRAS story and the glyphosate story are the same story. Industry's pressure, political cover, and Americans left to figure it out for themselves. I'm Michelle, and this is The Real Dirt, and now you know.